Today is the 17th of September 2022. It is now 1 o'clock, which means that precisely 78 years ago, down to the very hour, thousands of American paratroopers were coming down on this very field as part of Operation Market Garden. And dangling under one of those thousands of parachutes which filled the late summer sky was Private David Webster of the now famous Easy Company of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. To commemorate the 78-year anniversary of Operation Market Garden, DigitalBattlefieldTours presents this special 3-part series where we follow in Private Webster's footsteps for the coming 10 days of Operation Market Garden, to show you exactly where the action happened down to the hour precisely 78 years ago.
The flat green fields of Holland flashed by a few hundred feet below. I saw a windmill, a small pine forest, a canal crossing. In the distance, the spire of an immense church rose from a cluster of tile-roofed houses. No flak, I said to myself. No flak. Maybe this won't be so bad after all. We were jammed together so tightly that I could hardly breathe. Our left legs were all forward in a lockstep, ready to go. The jumpmaster was crouched by the equipment bundles in the door. The line of men surged forward, flinging their static lines at the tail as they jumped. I followed them. Stopping all fold, my mind went blank, and I ran out the door without taking the proper stance. I fell without knowing that I was falling, without even seeing where I was headed. Suddenly, the opening shock unsnapped me. I was spinning furiously, for my poor exit, combined with a badly packed chute, had twisted my risers and suspension lines so much that my head was pinned down hard, with my chin touching the top of my rifle case. I couldn't look up to check my canopy, but I didn't particularly care. Why worry, I thought, glad to be out of the plane and on my own. I'm alive and floating free. The 17th of September 1944 was a beautiful day for parachuting. Clear skies, barely any wind, and a bright late summer sun that was shining down on a field so big and flat that it may as well have been purpose-built for airborne landings. On that day, more than 6,500 men of the 101st Airborne Division jumped from over 400 planes in what the division's official history later called the most successful landing the division ever had. The drop was made 30 kilometers behind enemy lines, but for a moment it seemed like a parade ground display. Soon, these fields were alive with frantic activity. As the first wave struggled free from their harnesses, the next planeload of troopers came floating down, pulling at their risers to slow down their descent. Heavy equipment bundles kicked up clouds of dust as they impacted the ground. Discarded yellow life jackets punctuated the green fields, while parachutes gently swayed in the soft breeze. All the while, a continuous roar filled the air as wave after wave of transport planes added their share of paratroopers to the descending cloud. It didn't take long for the first curious onlookers to arrive. Expectations of an imminent liberation had reached a fever pitch in the days leading up to Market Garden. So when the locals saw the thousands of parachutes come down, they excitedly flocked to the landing fields. Farmers brought their horse carts to help gather supplies, while others cared for the injured or pointed out German positions on officers' maps. Webster had a brief bird's-eye view of the spectacle as he floated down beneath his parachute. Everything looked fine on the ground. There were no trees, rocks, roads or houses on the mile-square, brownish-green field that was our drop zone. Flat and smooth, the field was cut here and there by low barbed wire fences and shallow drainage ditches. No enemy was in sight. There appeared to be no hostile ground fire. The drop zone was alive with men. Hundreds of spotted green parachutes dotted the grass, while still more floated down in a beautiful spectacle, alive with shouting. This was a big jump, a regimental combat team on one field, and we were all landing together. It was a thrilling sight to see. My risers had untwisted by the time I was ready to land. I reached up, grasped all four, pulled down hard, and landed standing up. This was a sin in combat, but I couldn't resist the temptation, for the jump was so perfect. My chute collapsed, and I lay down quickly and got free of my harness. With amazing swiftness, the other men were already clearing off the field. I did not want to be left behind. There was no going back now. For the next 10 days, Webster would be right in the thick of Operation Market Garden, fighting as part of the famous Easy Company of the 101st Airborne Division. And we will follow him for every step of the way, from the perfect landing on day 1 to the troublesome capture of the first objectives, the bitter defensive battles against German armor and artillery, and the final desperate fighting for control of what became known as Hell's Highway. Along the way, we will cover Operation Market Garden, airborne tactics, Easy Company, Band of Brothers, and much more. We follow Webster because he was an aspiring novelist with a keen eye for the people and events around him. He had studied English literature at Harvard and could have avoided the worst of the war, but instead he went looking for it by volunteering as a parachute infantryman. He recorded his experiences with great detail and honesty in Parachute Infantry, a unique memoir that fuses the literary skill of a professional writer with the memories of a frontline rifleman. This battlefield tour will go beyond simply retelling Webster's story. It will place his individual account of battle within a thorough reconstruction of the larger tactical situation that he was part of. The accuracy of Webster's memoir has been carefully examined using a number of well-researched sources and other first-hand accounts. The result is a comprehensive battlefield guide that places one man's personal narrative within the bigger picture of Operation Market Garden. The exact locations where the events happened have been pinpointed through Second World War era maps and aerial photographs, as well as modern satellite imagery. All footage has been recorded at these sites on the precise time and date that the events happened 78 years ago, where possible even down to the very hour. Digital Battlefield Tours is proud to present you the result of this effort. A battlefield tour told through the writings of someone who was there, on the exact ground that it happened, precisely 78 years later. Before we rejoin Webster on the landing fields, we should take a moment to go over why he was here in the first place. Operation Market Garden. Understanding the origins and intent of Market Garden requires a look at the larger strategic situation on the Western Front. When the operation took its final form on the 10th of September, the great Allied breakout from the Normandy beachhead was reaching its culmination point. The Allied armies that thundered across France and Belgium had run away from their cross-channel supply lines at breakneck speed, while the Germans were falling back on theirs. Just as the Allied spearheads were running out of steam, the Germans were consolidating their battered divisions behind more defensible terrain, the formidable concrete defenses of the Siegfried Line along the German border and the natural river barriers of the southern Netherlands. With supplies stretched thin and a rainy autumn fast approaching, Allied commanders feared their offensive would bog down right in front of these defenses. A return to indecisive First World War-era trench warfare was the last thing this generation of generals wanted, so they were willing to take greater risks to keep the momentum going. Yet most of their forces were already committed along the broad Western Front that now stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Even if they had fresh divisions, shipping them to the continent would only worsen the already critical supply situation. If the Allies wanted to reinforce their success, it would have to come from the sky. Ever since the Normandy invasion, an entire Allied airborne army had stood waiting on English airfields for their next drop. It was now decided to commit these airborne reserves for one big push across the Rhine River. It was Field Marshal Montgomery who championed the use of these airborne forces in the sector of his British Second Army. An offensive here would bypass the Siegfried Line, trap German forces in the western Netherlands, and cross the Rhine River at its northernmost point, where it formed a bridgehead for subsequent operations into the North German plain. On the operational level, Market Garden consisted of two parts. The airborne units, 2 American divisions, 1 British division and a Polish brigade, were responsible for Market, seizing bridges and securing the road from Eindhoven in the south all the way to Arnhem in the north. This then opened the way for the mechanized garden part. The British 30th Corps would break through the German defences along the Belgian-Dutch border on its own, but once through, linked up with the Allied airborne forces that had cleared the road ahead and drive effortlessly north beyond the Rhine. It would then push on until it reached the shore of the IJsselmeer, cutting off all German forces to the west of it, while also securing bridgeheads to the east over the IJssel River for subsequent offensives into Germany. While 30th Corps was the centerpiece of the operation, the other two corps of 2nd Army would also attack on the flanks. Market Garden was an ambitious plan with little room for error. It was based on the belief that the German forces were on the brink of total defeat, and greater risks were justified to push them over the edge. Especially the daytime market landings were an audacious show of force, flaunting Allied air superiority in the face of the powerless German Luftwaffe. Meanwhile, 30th Corps only had one single road as its sole line of advance. Any blown bridge, ambush or roadblock was guaranteed to upset the strict timetable, which meant Market Garden could easily spiral out of control. Failure by the airborne to secure the road would lead to delays for 30th Corps, which meant other airborne divisions had to wait longer for the tanks to arrive, which meant they were less likely to hold onto their stretch of road, which meant even more delays for 30th Corps down the line. So this was what Operation Market Garden came down to. A great airborne carpet would be rolled out by 3 airborne divisions and a brigade, opening the way for one of the greatest mechanized drives of the entire war. The ambitious reach of the operation had tactical consequences for the units on the ground, which brings us to the 101st Airborne Division that Webster was part of. Its role in Market Garden was to secure the southern tip of the airborne carpet, a 20-kilometer stretch of road and its many bridges from Eindhoven in the south to Veghel in the north. They would then have to keep this lifeline open while 30th Corps passed through to relieve the other airborne divisions. 2 restrictions were carried over from the operational level. The first was the time of the jump, which was scheduled for 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Taking into account the time needed for regrouping and marching to the objectives, this left just a small part of the afternoon to complete Day 1 objectives before the sun set. Secondly, because the sheer size of the operation outgrew the pool of available transport planes, less than half of Market's allocated manpower and equipment could be flown in on the first day. This meant all airborne divisions had to split their forces in smaller waves that would fly in over the course of several days if the autumn weather allowed it. Given these restrictions, General Taylor of the 101st Airborne Division made 2 important decisions on how he would deploy his force. The first had to do with his drop zones. To prevent another Normandy, where his troops were scattered far and wide, Taylor opted for the densest drop possible, squeezing 2 full parachute regiments plus the 70 gliders into the Sonse Heide, a triangle of fields wedged between the villages of Son, Best and Sint-Oederode. Only the 501st Regiment landed on drop zones closer to their objectives in Veghel. This concentration came at the cost of surprise, as the central drop zone was not necessarily close to any of the objectives. The second decision was that the initial drop would be infantry heavy. Taylor committed all 3 of his Parachute Infantry Regiments on Day 1, with only the necessary command and support elements to accompany them. The artillery and other heavy weapons would have to follow later. This meant the majority of the 6,000 plus men who were dropped on Day 1 were foot-mobile close combat troops, armed only with man-portable weapons. Taylor saw no other choice given the dispersion of his objectives. Taking all bridges in just the afternoon of Day 1, while also guarding the drop zones for future reinforcements, required as many men as he could fit in the available planes. And so it was that on the 17th of September, the might of 2 full Parachute Infantry Regiments filled the sky above the Sonse Heide. Webster and the rest of the 506th landed to the south on Drop Zone Charlie, while the 502nd landed on the northern half on Drop Zone Baker. The gliders came in an hour later on Landing Zone William, a strip of fields between the 2 regimental drop zones. These gliders carried the jeeps and other heavy equipment of the accompanying headquarters, signals, medical and reconnaissance units. Statistically speaking, the drop was a resounding success. the entire 101st Airborne Division suffered less than a 2% personnel loss and 5% equipment loss. The gliders were the most prone to accidents. 17 out of the total of 70 either missed the landing zone or crashed on it. The worst accident happened when 2 gliders collided in midair as they were coming in to land. As Webster was freeing himself from his harness on Drop Zone Charlie, he witnessed what being part of the 2% looked like. To quote, "A C-47 came over low, streaming fire from a wing. I watched with gritted teeth as the men tried to get out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. They were still jumping when the plane slammed into the ground and blew up half a mile away. God, I thought that could have been me." What Webster doesn't recount, but is mentioned by other sources, was the horrific fate of 2 unfortunate paratroopers who were descending in the path of the doomed plane and were killed by its propeller as they were dangling helplessly in the wrong place at the wrong time. The crash didn't occupy Webster for long. Things had quieted down around him, so he took his chance and cut out a piece of his parachute to use as a scarf. He had always wanted one as a souvenir, but didn't dare cut up a training chute and had been too busy in Normandy. Webster's leisurely pace was quickened when German artillery began bursting over the drop zone. The same battery that had taken down the plane was now bracketing the landing fields. Webster hurried south towards the tree line, where a white smoke grenade marked the 2nd Battalion rally point. There was a brief moment of tension in the assembly area when a column of 5 German tanks was spotted heading up the road east of the drop zone. No anti-tank guns had yet been brought in, so the paratroopers would have to rely on their short-range bazookas to fend off the attack. Thankfully, P-51 Mustangs were guarding the landing fields and dove down to strafe the tanks. The hammering of their 50 caliber machine guns reverberated across the Sonse Heide, and soon Webster saw a column of greasy black smoke rise in the distance. A patrol discovered 2 outdated tank models abandoned by the side of the road, while the others had fled without firing a shot. It turned out that they were remnants of the 2nd Battalion of the Fallschirm Panzer Ersatz- und Ausbildungsregiment Hermann Göring, a training unit belonging to a Luftwaffe ground division. Its 2nd Battalion was made up of instructors and their recruits, and outfitted with obsolete tanks only fit for training. Despite this, they had been thrown into the teeth of the British advance on the 7th of September, in a desperate effort to slow it down. After suffering horrific losses, its demoralized remnants were pulled back behind the German lines at the hamlet of Wolfswinkel, just in time for Market Garden to drop right on top of them. While even their vintage armor could have been lethal to the lightly armed and disorganized paratroopers, they were quickly dissuaded from mounting an attack by the watchful Mustangs. After briefly stopping to witness this display of Allied air power, Webster settled down with his squad in a brambly ditch beside a sandy forest road. The excitement of the jump had died down by now. Webster opened a K-ration for lunch as the men waited and waited and waited in the sweltering sun, choking on the dust kicked up by columns of passing troops. Webster hated the Army's insistence to always hurry up and wait, but even an airborne landing as perfect as the one that day still needed some time to organize before it could strike out as a coherent force. The Day 1 mission for the 506th Regiment was to attack south from the landing fields towards the small village of Son, where a bridge spanned the Wilhelmina Canal. Taking this bridge opened the way further south to the city of Eindhoven, which the regiment had to capture before 30th Corps arrived. Eindhoven would be the first link-up point between Market and Garden and the start of the Great Airborne Carpet. The regiment's plan of attack was for its 1st Battalion to form up as quickly as possible and seize the bridge at Son, which was just a few kilometers south of the drop zone. The rest of the regiment could take a little longer to get organized and would then march straight down the main road, over the Son Bridge and into the city of Eindhoven. So, 45 minutes after the drop, when Webster was still having lunch, the troops of the 1st Battalion were rushing down to Son in hastily assembled groups. They approached through the woods west of the village, hoping to outflank any resistance and reach the bridge undetected. Unfortunately for them, They could have picked no worse approach, for this maneuver brought 1st Battalion right into the field of fire of two 88mm flak guns. These were versatile pieces, being equally deadly against planes, tanks or infantry. From their well-protected gun pits, the 88s fired high explosive shells into the pine trees around 1st Battalion, unleashing a horrific storm of steel and wooden splinters. What was supposed to be a flanking attack turned into a slow and bloody frontal assault. As this was going on, the rest of the regiment finally started moving east through the forest. They swung south on the highway and headed into Somme, expecting to march across an already captured bridge. As we now follow in Webster's footsteps from the landing fields to Somme, we have a few minutes to discuss airborne organization. By now you will have heard me mention divisions and battalions and so on, so let's take this moment to explain how these fit together, while footage from the journey to Somme plays in the background. Starting at the top, we have the 101st Airborne Division, nicknamed the Screaming Eagles and led by Major General Maxwell Taylor. An American Airborne Division closely resembled an infantry division, but was made lighter so it could be deployed by parachute or glider. This came at the cost of organic motor transport and heavy weapons, as trucks and heavy artillery pieces weren't air transportable. In essence, the Airborne Division traded firepower and ground mobility for being air mobile. This deal was only worth it as long as the division was used in its intended role. It was meant to land behind enemy lines and seize lightly guarded objectives in support of a ground offensive. The ground troops would then break through the enemy front line and relieve the airborne. That way they wouldn't be forced into a high firepower battle of attrition that they weren't equipped for. An American Airborne Division was a large unit, numbering over 8,000 men. The division's primary subunits were its regiments. The 101st had 3 Parachute Infantry Regiments, the 501st, 502nd and 506th, as well as a 4th Glider Infantry Regiment, the 327th. Besides its infantry regiments, the division also had a number of smaller battalions and companies of the supporting arms, such as the airborne artillery, engineers, signals and so on. Webster was in the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment under Colonel Robert Sink. Colonel Sink was known as the father of the regiment, as he commanded it from its creation in 1942 up to the end of the war. Even Webster liked Colonel Sink, which was rare for him to admit about an officer. He especially enjoyed the colonel's famously colorful and comedic speeches that preceded a combat jump. A Parachute Infantry Regiment numbered over 2,000 paratroopers, who were organized in 3 battalions numbered 1, 2, 3, each accounting for around 700 men. Webster was in the 2nd Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Strayer. Airborne battalions had a headquarters company and 3 rifle companies. The headquarters company included non-combat support roles, such as cooks and clerks, but also a machine gun and a mortar platoon. The rifle companies were numbered throughout the regiment using the phonetic letters of the alphabet. So for the 2nd Battalion, its rifle companies were named Dog, Easy and Fox. This brings us to the famous Easy Company that Webster was part of. Easy Company was led by Captain Richard Winters, who was 26 years old at the time and entrusted with the lives of the nearly 200 men that made up his company. Webster didn't write much about Winters, describing him briefly as a big, strong young man with sandy hair who had won the Distinguished Service Cross in Normandy. Organization at the level of a rifle company and below can get a bit confusing, as combat troops had to improvise with available equipment and manpower. While Easy Company is one of the most well-documented small units of the Second World War, there is still a surprising amount of disagreement over who did what and when. The following is therefore a composite of different sources, with the most credible ones taking precedence. Easy Company consisted of a company HQ and 3 platoons. The company HQ included Captain Winters as the company commander and First Lieutenant Harry Welsh as his executive officer. In combat, they were accompanied by messengers and a radio man. The HQ also included some non-combat supporting roles, such as the supply sergeant and company clerk. Webster was in Easy Company's 1st platoon, led by 1st Lieutenant Thomas Peacock, a former battalion supply officer. 2nd Lieutenant Charles Hudson was the assistant leader and Floyd Talbert the platoon sergeant. Together with a platoon guide, radio men and 2 messengers, they formed the platoon headquarters. There is some disagreement in the sources on whether Hudson or Peacock was the platoon leader, but this distinction lost its relevancy on the 4th day of Market Garden, when Hudson was wounded, leaving Peacock solely in charge. Webster described the ideal officer as rugged, aggressive, competent, cheerful, informal and understanding. Someone who stood up for his men against his superiors. According to Webster, Lieutenant Peacock was none of this. In combat he gave nonsensical orders to his men, while he himself stayed in the rear. Out of combat he was petty and uncaring. Webster's disdain for Peacock grew to the point that he hated him more than the enemy, and he even contemplated shooting the lieutenant to save himself from his dismal leadership. While others in 1st Platoon voiced similar but milder complaints about Lieutenant Peacock, it should be noted that Captain Winters did not. In fact, he frequently used Peacock's 1st Platoon as the company's lead unit, apparently unaware of any internal strife. The platoon's excellent performance, in spite of its troubled leadership, may have been due to the comparatively large number of Normandy veterans in NCO positions, who were mostly left free to fight their own way due to Peacock's frequent absence in combat. Speaking of NCO-level leadership, we have now reached the 3 rifle squads of the platoon. The Airborne platoon also had a 4th mortar squad that gave it some indirect fire capability. At least on paper, the Airborne platoon was only supposed to have 2 rifle squads, but the sources agree that Easy had started using 3 squads by the time of Market Garden, a change that was formalized for all parachute infantry in December 1944. This would increase overall platoon strength to 49 men. Webster was in the 3rd Rifle Squad of 1st Platoon. As these were his closest friends and they will feature throughout this tour, it is worth going over them in detail. The squad leader was Sergeant Robert Rader, a tall, thin man who Webster described as a steady leader. Webster was prone to argue with him, but there were never any serious disagreements between the two. In fact, he was glad to have Rader as a shield between him and Lieutenant Peacock, as Rader was experienced and confident enough to disregard some of the lieutenant's worst orders. Corporal Donald Hubler was the assistant squad leader. Webster called him an exuberant boy who seemed to really enjoy the war. He was in many ways the polar opposite of Rader, but they got along well because they both came from the same town in Ohio. Webster himself was the 1st scout of the squad. Private Cecil Pace, a short man from the south, was the 2nd scout. Having 2 dedicated scouts in every rifle squad was typical of American infantry organization. They were equipped like regular riflemen, but were often the more experienced soldiers who had developed a feeling for when something didn't seem right. Pace, however, was a replacement, but Webster was confident he would hold his own in combat. Pace was also an excellent marksman, which came in handy because Webster described himself as the worst shot in the company. Webster was probably made 1st scout because he was a Normandy veteran, although back then he was actually an ammunition carrier in 2nd Battalion's machine gun platoon. It was only after he was wounded in Normandy that Webster asked to be transferred to a rifle company. He wrote that he was tired of tagging along and doing nothing. As a rifleman, Webster hoped to find some independence and a chance to close with the enemy, something he was still eager to experience. Webster was 22 years old in 1944. Being Harvard educated and from a wealthy family from New York State made him stand out from almost everybody else in the company. Many saw him as the Harvard guy who was always taking notes or writing letters home, but his squad mates knew Webster as a competent, albeit reluctant soldier. Webster's motivations for joining the Airborne are complex and at times conflicting. With his education and connections, he could have done almost anything else during the war, but he insisted on joining the Airborne. He had leadership potential and spoke German decently well, but instead of leveraging this for a position in Company HQ, he rather stayed in a rifle squad. If he had to be in the army, he wanted to be in the fighting part. Webster was a strong individualist. He despised almost all officers, hated the rules and regulations of the army, which he compared to a prison, and the indifference it had for the lives and well-being of the enlisted men. Yet he also loved the feeling of belonging to something greater, of being part of history and fighting a just war against barbarism, which is how he saw the Second World War. Being the first scout of a rifle squad didn't give Webster the freedom he so desired. Over the course of Market Garden, his eagerness turned to apathy, and soon Webster wanted nothing more than out of the army. He vowed never to volunteer for anything ever again, and hoped for a $1 million wound that got him out of combat. But as things stood now, on the 17th of September, he was still somewhat eager and curious for what combat as a rifleman would be like. Moving on from the scouts, we have the machine gun team, an airborne specialty. Unlike the regular infantry, who had a BAR as their squad automatic weapon, the paratroopers carried the heavier M1919 machine gun. In the regular infantry, these guns were used at the company level in a dedicated fire support platoon. But in the airborne, with the constant risk of misdrops and scattered units, the 1919s were pushed all the way down to squad level to ensure that even the smallest unit had a proper base of fire. This same reason is why the airborne platoon had its own 60mm mortar squad. In the close quarter fighting of the Normandy hedgerows, it was found that the tripod-mounted M1919A4 was poorly suited for mobile squad-level combat. So the updated M1919A6 was introduced to the airborne just in time for Market Garden. This hedgerow modification, as Webster called it, added a bipod and shoulder stock to the weapon, so one man could quickly bring it into action. That is precisely how 3rd Squad used it, as Sergeant Rader liked to keep his machine gun team near the front of his squad, so it could quickly put down fire when contact was made. The main gunner was Mike Massaconi, who came from Massachusetts and liked to joke around and give people nicknames like Knothead, which is how he called his assistant gunner Clancy Leal, who was one of the youngest men in the squad. Leal was only 16 when he volunteered for the Airborne in 1942, having lied about his age in order to join. He had already fought in Normandy as a gunner in 2nd Battalion's machine gun platoon, but was transferred to Easy Company to get it back to full strength for Market Garden. The machine gun could quickly burn through ammunition, so 2 riflemen doubled as ammunition bearers, Privates John Genovac and James Miller. Webster was good friends with Genovac, who he described as dour, stubborn and sarcastic, but generally reliable. It was their mutual dislike of the army that really bonded the two together. Private Miller was another young member of the squad, having yet to reach his 20s. Webster was worried about him because he feared Miller lacked the independence and initiative that was needed in the airborne. As we will see in the 2nd episode, Webster was right to worry about him. The squad grenadier was named Ferris Rice. Webster described him as nervous and somewhat of a busybody who liked to give the replacements unwanted advice on just about anything. Being a grenadier meant he carried rifle grenades that were fired from his M1 rifle. This gave the squad some indirect fire capability, bridging the gap between a thrown hand grenade and the platoon mortar. Finally, we have 3 regular riflemen: Donald Wiseman, Elijah Weitzel and Max Meff. Wiseman was a good friend of Webster. As a 25-year-old, he was the oldest man in the squad. Webster described him as a burly miner from Colorado who was intelligent and highly independent, one of the best soldiers he knew. Wiseman also got along very well with Weitzel, a young soldier who Webster characterized as full of talk and wisecracks. Only Meff was the odd one out. He was actually a battalion cook, but had volunteered to join the combat troops, partly under peer pressure from the other cooks. Webster described him as short and plump and not a trained soldier. He didn't like having him in the squad, but at least he seemed eager and earnest. Half the squad were replacements who had yet to experience combat. The others, like Webster, had seen action in Normandy, but often in other units. Now they would fight together as 3rd Squad, 1st Platoon, Easy Company, one small part of the 101st Airborne Division, which was just one part of Market Garden, the largest airborne operation in history. We have now reached what in 1944 would be the northern edge of Zon. In the distance the church tower can be seen, and beyond, but yet out of sight, is the vital bridge over the Wilhelmina Canal. While Webster writes that the village was quiet and deserted, most other sources agree that there were plenty of civilians waiting along the road to greet the Americans. Webster was the lead scout of his squad. This meant that he could also be the lead scout of his platoon, and occasionally, if his platoon was out in front, he could even be the company's lead scout. Unfortunately for Webster, this happened to be the case as they marched into Zon. Webster was a very cautious soldier, who liked to do things his own way, so being the point man of an entire company made him incredibly nervous. Luckily for him, Dog Company was leading the column. Webster claims they were from Fox Company, but all other sources agree that Dog was in the lead, followed by Easy, followed by the 2nd Battalion's headquarters, followed by Fox Company in the rear. 2nd Battalion was followed by regimental headquarters with a platoon of attached airborne engineers, with 3rd Battalion following behind. 1st Battalion was still struggling with the 288s west of the village. As the column advanced deeper into Zon, Webster grew ever more suspicious. Something about the village didn't seem right to him. He took the safety off his rifle as he peered into the houses on either side of the road, while also making sure not to lose the tail of Dog Company. Webster was so focused on his immediate surroundings that he ignored what sounded like the rustling of paper passing high above his head. Out in front, Dog Company had run into an 88 that was dug in on the main street, just north of the bridge. Its first shell went high, flew over the head of the column and exploded against a building, knocking down some men from Easy Company's 2nd platoon. A German machine gun joined in, sending rounds ricocheting down the cobblestone street. 2nd Battalion's companies quickly dispersed. Dog dove between the houses on the right of the road, Easy turned left at the crossroads, and Fox headed for the area around the church. To Webster's shock, the protective screen of Dog Company had suddenly disappeared. The moment he turned left at the crossroads, he became the first American in enemy territory. Webster's nerves were now fully strained. He was sure there was an ambush waiting for him somewhere in the village. Clutching his rifle at his hip with the bayonet fixed, he slowly inched forward down the curving street, staying close to the buildings and scanning every window ahead of him. Lieutenant Hudson, who was 1st Platoon's assistant leader, shouted at him to get a move on. Webster was holding up the entire company and time was of the essence. Webster had been neutral towards Hudson so far, describing him as a sensible officer and a counterweight to Lieutenant Peacock's terrible leadership. But now that Hudson was driving Webster into enemy territory, he cursed him. "I'm out here to draw fire, and you want me to run right into it," Webster angrily thought to himself. With a pounding heart and sweating palms, he reluctantly quickened his pace, expecting the sharp crack of a German rifle at any moment.
We just turned left at the crossroads in the center of the village of Zon and are now moving down this road where precisely 78 years ago Webster would have been the first American in enemy territory. He was the lead scout of Easy Company, walking behind Dog Company, but of course the company split up once they came under fire from the 88 down the main road, with Dog going to the right and then Easy heading left. And this maneuver suddenly made Webster the first American in enemy territory, as he was at the head of the column moving down this road, approaching this bridge you can see behind me over the Dommel River, although it is more of a creek. And what happened on this precise spot 78 years ago, Webster recounts in some detail, which I will now quote directly from him on the exact spot that it happened, on the exact time that it happened 78 years ago. To quote, "I stepped out at a quicker gait and following the road as it curved to the left and then to the right, passed beyond the village. A bridge over a small creek called the Dommel River lay ahead. I looked at it and around it and then beyond it and stopped cold. There, 100 yards beyond the bridge by the side of the road, near a stone barn, were 3 Germans. The one in the center squatted behind a machine gun with the others beside him. All of them waved to me in greeting. "You'll be sorry I fought, you sons of bitches." Grasping my rifle by the upper handguard and the small of the stock, I flung it above my head, parallel to the ground, as a signal for the men behind me. Enemy in sight. In 1 second I had made the motion, yanked the rifle to my shoulder and aimed at the machine gunner. I wanted to kill him first because he was the most dangerous. The Germans continued to wave. Evidently, they thought we were German paratroopers come to reinforce them. My eyesight was better than theirs, for I could tell a German right away by his stance, which was utterly unlike that of an American soldier. But I was not as relaxed as they were. Tense with nervousness, I leveled on the machine gunner's chest, winced and pulled the trigger. The bullet cracked above the German's head, and before I could fire another round, all 3 men had disappeared behind the barn. I cursed myself.
Webster dropped to the ground, making himself as small as possible for the inevitable return fire. But nothing came. Instead, Lieutenant Hudson ran up to him and ordered Webster across the bridge. He quickly darted to the other side and scrambled for the shelter of the creek's steep slope. Webster had just settled in when he heard the order to halt become louder and louder as it was shouted along the column behind him. Glancing over his shoulder, he saw the company HQ arrive and pivot easy to the south. Webster was ordered back. Feeling vastly relieved to be a follower again, he fell in with the rear of the company. His brief heroics, he decided, were now over. Just as Webster had feared, Lieutenant Hudson had almost driven him to his death. But thanks to his good eyesight and a fair bit of luck, Webster had driven off a machine gun that could have inflicted heavy losses on Easy Company. He had fulfilled his role as lead scout. Having secured the Dommel Bridge, Easy Company now headed south through the fields and backyards of eastern Son until it reached the Wilhelmina Canal. On the other side of the road, Dog was also pushing for the bridge, while further west, 1st Battalion was closing in on the 288s. As Webster struggled over barbed wire fences, across a sewer-filled ditch and through some backyards, a booming explosion shook the air. When he reached the canal embankment, he saw what had happened. Their objective was blown up. Understanding what had gone wrong requires a closer look at the German side. In the days leading up to Market Garden, as the Allied advance slowed down at the Dutch-Belgian border, German commanders went to work deepening their defenses. The many rivers, creeks and canals of the southern Netherlands gave them plenty of ready-made barriers to anchor their defense on. The junction of 2 waterways in particular, the Wilhelmina Canal and the Zuid-Willemsvaart, caught their attention as a natural backstop. On the 14th of September, a mere 3 days before Market Garden, the command of Stabsgeneral zur Besondere Verwendung II was created and given to Oberst von Hoffmann. He was assigned a hastily assembled collection of third-rate troops in order to set up a defensive line along the Wilhelmina Canal. A similar command was created for the defense of the Zuid-Willemsvaart. All minor bridges were immediately destroyed, leaving only the larger ones, such as the bridge at Son, intact, but wired for demolition at a moment's notice. Of the forces available to von Hoffmann, we know for sure that the 4th Battery of the 428th Schwere Flakabteilung was holding Son. Their reported strength consisted of 6 88mm guns and 3 20mm pieces. Post-battle photographic evidence confirms the presence of at least 3 of their 88s in Son. One was dug in on the main street, while the other 2 were emplaced along the northern canal bank west of the bridge. All 3 were positioned to deal with an expected British mechanized attack from the south, with little regard for their fields of fire to the north. Some sources also report seeing a 4th gun south of the canal that was not yet dug in. The battery was still being emplaced when the Americans attacked on the 17th, which may account for the missing pieces. According to its table of organization and equipment, a heavy flak battery would also have 3 machine guns for self-defense, which explains the one Webster ran into, as well as some others that were seen firing around the bridge. What should have been a lightning strike by 1st Battalion that opened the way to Eindhoven turned into a slow, broad-front assault that occupied most of the regiment for about 2 hours. Eventually, the battered 1st Battalion would capture the two 88s west of town at bayonet point. In the center, a team from Dog Company outflanked the 88 on the main road, disabled the gun with a bazooka shot and killed the fleeing crew with submachine gun fire. On the eastern flank, we have seen how Easy Company, with Webster in the lead, secured the Dommel Bridge, drove away the machine gun on the opposite bank and then swept south towards the main bridge. But in the meantime, the Germans had taken the detonator south of the canal and blew the bridge, just as the leading elements of 1st and 2nd Battalion were within reach. The sudden detonation threw the closest American paratroopers to the ground, while others scrambled for cover as chunks of stone and other debris rained down. A German machine gun opened fire across the canal, but was driven back by the combined weight of American rifle, machine gun, bazooka and mortar fire. This firefight was mostly over by the time Webster reached the canal. All he remembers was a distant rifle shot and a burning barn far to the south. Small figures ran out of the barn and tumbled down from a poplar tree close to it, where they had evidently been watching us. A headquarters company machine gunner on the bank of the canal ran a belt through his .30 caliber, but the bullets were high and hurt nobody. A few riflemen joined him. I held my fire. If I couldn't hit a man at 100 yards, I certainly couldn't hit one at 600. It was by now late in the afternoon, but the weather was still nice and warm, so Corporal Gordon Carson, one of the 1st platoon runners, dove into the canal to fetch a rowboat that was moored on the other side. Some men from 1st Squad used it to paddle across and investigate the houses on the opposite bank. To their west, 1st Battalion started crossing the canal using similar improvised means. Over at the wrecked bridge, the platoon of airborne engineers went to work on a footbridge. Luckily for them, the Son Bridge was designed to let shipping through by turning sideways on a small concrete island. The explosion had destroyed the roadway, but the island remained and enough debris was sticking out of the water that an improvised footbridge could be made from rowboats, empty oil drums, barn doors and telephone poles. Easy Company's turn to run across this rickety construction came at twilight. Webster recalled that, after a long wait, we started over, rushing down the planks one by one into the arms of an engineer who caught us and steadied us for the run up the other side. A slow process, the company crossing took almost an hour. It would take until midnight for the entire regiment to get across. The original plan to capture Eindhoven just before dark on day 1 was now out of the question, and neither was a night attack considered a viable option, so the regiment established a bridgehead around the hamlet of Bocht, from where it would march on Eindhoven the next day. Unbeknownst to the paratroopers, 30th Corps had also halted for the night short of Eindhoven, and would have to continue fighting its way north the next day. While the 17th had started as a beautiful late summer day, it turned into a cold and rainy autumn night. Webster, using a few words of German, had talked his way into a nearby farmhouse where he, along with Genovac and Hubler, traded cigarettes and chocolate for some preserved meat and fruit. Webster wrote that the farmer was overwhelmed. These were the first decent cigarettes he had had in 5 years. As for the candy, he would save it for his little boy, who had never tasted chocolate. The Netherlands and its people had made a good first impression on Webster. In a letter home, he praised the country as rich, progressive and very modern, and noted how welcoming and helpful the civilians were. Nothing on that first day, however, could quite prepare him for the reception that was waiting for them in Eindhoven. The regiment regrouped at the crack of dawn and marched for Eindhoven, leaving only an understrength platoon from 1st Battalion and the airborne engineers to defend Son. 3rd Battalion was in the lead with orders to march straight down the road. No time was to be wasted, as there were still 4 bridges in Eindhoven that had to be captured. Sporadic German resistance was encountered along the road and swiftly swept away until 3rd Battalion reached the suburb of Woensel. 2 German 88s forced its lead companies to the ground, so Colonel Sink ordered 2nd Battalion to bypass the position to the east. 2nd Battalion's Easy and Dog companies headed straight for Eindhoven, while Fox peeled off and struck the German position from the flank, taking out the 88s in a close-range street fight. Webster's Easy Company pushed hard for the city center. Sniper fire was encountered on the outskirts, but once inside, the men found Eindhoven practically undefended. Instead, thousands of civilians filled the streets to welcome the Americans. No one can describe the scene better than Webster himself. To quote, "The column stopped and the civilians brought us chairs to sit on, milk and tea to drink, and fresh fruit to eat. Thoroughly enjoying the role of liberator, we chatted with them gaily, for it was wonderful to feel wanted and welcome, to meet someone for the first time who appreciated what you were doing. Orange flags and armbands appeared everywhere, and the cheering, clapping crowds soon thickened so much that we could barely move. The civilians wanted to help us, to shake our hands, to pat our backs and thank us for driving away the Germans. The applause and din of gratitude was so deafening that we had to shout to each other to be heard. It was the most sincere Thanksgiving demonstration that any of us had ever witnessed, and it fixed Holland forever in our hearts." The rest of the regiment soon streamed into town. Among them were airborne radio men who carried their heavy equipment up the nearest church tower. By the end of the morning, they had finally made contact with 30th Corps. It turned out they were held up by German 88s just south of Eindhoven. But as news of the capture of the city spread through the German ranks, their resistance collapsed and British tanks raced north, entering an ecstatic Eindhoven filled with celebrating civilians and paratroopers. The British, having heard of the blown bridge at Somme over the radio, brought forward bridging material. After working through the night, a Bailey bridge was completed early next morning, and soon 30th Corps was racing through the American lines. It hadn't gone smoothly, but the result was finally there. An armored corps thundering northward over an airborne carpet. Market Garden was now truly underway. The evening of the 18th of September marked a turning point for the Screaming Eagles. In the past 2 days they had fought like paratroopers were supposed to, landing behind enemy lines and striking at weakly held objectives with the element of surprise. Now that they had linked up with 30th Corps, they became the base of a salient that drove northward towards the other 2 airborne divisions at Nijmegen and Arnhem. The 101st could now count on the support of British armour and artillery, as well as their own glider reinforcements that came in on the 18th. A new phase in the operation now dawned for the American paratroopers, one for which they were not ideally suited. The 101st had to settle into a defensive posture along the single road north, to guard it against imminent German counterattacks. The advance of the 2 British corps on the flanks was much slower compared to that of 30th Corps, which left the corridor narrow and vulnerable. Even with the reinforcements, there simply weren't enough men in the 101st Airborne Division to secure both sides of this vital artery as well as its many bridges. In the coming days, the American paratroopers, together with British tankers, would have to fight a running battle along the corridor, fending off increasingly vicious German attempts to strangle the Allied lifeline.
It is now a little past 4 on the 17th of September, which means that the bridge over the Wilhelmina Canal, which you can see behind me, has just been blown up by the German defenders just as the first American paratroopers were about to cross it. And it was from this spot here, a little to the east on the northern bank of the canal, that Webster would have first seen the wreckage of the bridge. Losing this bridge over the Wilhelmina Canal certainly was a setback for the paratroopers of the 506th. It was one of their day one objectives after all, but we now know that the real crisis point at Somme wasn't the destruction of the bridge on day one. No, the true crisis came a few days later, when suddenly a German armored brigade appeared from the east and attacked right here on the evening of the 19th, just as a Bailey bridge had been built. In the next episode, we will explore Webster's part in fending off this sudden German armored thrust, which for him and the Men of Easy Company culminated in a battle at the village of Nuenen on the 20th of September. This has been our first episode. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in our next episode when we visit Nuenen on the 20th of September.